Good evening, everybody. Welcome tonight. We're so glad to have you all here. I am Catherine Fluck Price. I am one of the pastors of Trinity. Some of you are Trinity folks. Some of you know Marsha from years ago from Trinity or from the University of Florida. Some of you have seen a flyer around town about this or saw it on Facebook and have come tonight, and we are really grateful for your presence. I wanted to take a minute and introduce Dr. Marsha Wiggins, the Reverend Dr. Marsha Wiggins. Marsha came to Trinity as the associate pastor in 1983. I had just graduated from high school, so we really didn't overlap very much. That wasn't to make you feel old. You were very young too. You were a baby then as well. But we didn't overlap because then I went away to college and I never really, well, I came back one summer and was on staff as a youth intern when Marsha was here. Marsha went on and served through 1988 as the associate pastor, and then when the senior pastor, Reverend Dean Martin, died of a malignant brain tumor, she became the interim for a few months. Then she went on and took another appointment as a United Methodist minister in Fort Pierce, and then she came back to Gainesville because she missed everybody so much, and got a Ph.D. in counseling at the University of Florida. After that, she went to the University of Colorado in Denver and was a professor there for a dozen or so years, 19 years, oh my goodness, for 19 years, and then retired and came back to Florida. And now in her retirement, she is serving, I have to read this, as the executive director for the Association for Counselor Education and Supervision. And she's still professor emerita of counseling at the University of Colorado. When Marsha was here, she had a young son, and some of you all knew Cameron, and she's here tonight to talk about her experience and to share more of her story in hopes that it will help you all with your own story or with people who you know who have suffered the loss, who have struggled with addiction or have a family member who has struggled with addiction. And I'm really looking forward to her sharing tonight. I'll just share one brief story, and that is that I don't know that I would be in ministry as an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church if it were not for Marsha. Because that summer, when I came back from my freshman year in college and was an intern, I'd grown up at Trinity, I'd been involved, I practically lived at the church, and no one had ever asked me about going into ministry. And that summer, Marsha said, "Catherine, have you ever thought about going into ministry?" And just that one question started a wave of exploration and prayer and answering a call into ministry. And so I thank Marsha for that question and the impact that asking that one question had on me, and I'm sure had on others that you interacted with over the years as well. So, will you welcome Marsha?
It's been a long time since I've stood in front of anybody at Trinity. It's been actually 35 years since I arrived at Trinity and almost 31 since I left. So it's a little odd and very wonderful to be back here with so many familiar faces and to be able to share my story. Hopefully it will provide some insight, some help, some support for those of you who need it. I want to start by just saying thank you to Catherine. As she said, we go back a long time, and I'm not sure whether to take credit for all of the wonderful ministry that she's been doing over these years, or whether I'm being blamed for the path. But anyway, it's been a wonderful comradeship, friendship over all these years, and I'm grateful that we are still connected. I'm also grateful to Roger Stroud of this church, who has been really in charge of a team of planners who have put this event together tonight. And I'm so glad that there are many, many types of recovery programs available in this community and other communities. And in the work that Roger and I have done together, he shared with me a program called the Christian 12-Step Ministry, and this is the workbook that goes along with it. It's based on the 12 steps with Alcoholics Anonymous, but it has a very specific Christian spin. And if you know much about Alcoholics Anonymous, it is really focused on a higher power. In this program, that higher power is Jesus Christ. And it's really connected to a kind of biblical basis for helping people in recovery. So this program is going to get off the ground soon, and I just wanted to thank Roger for letting me know about it and to share a little bit about it with you who may have friends, neighbors, family members, clients who could find this kind of program useful. So, as I said, 35 years ago, I arrived at Trinity as the associate pastor, and I served for 5 years. And looking back, I have to say that those were 5 of the best years of my career. And of course, I'm a very loyal member of the Gator Nation. I earned 3 degrees at the University of Florida, and there are people here who suffered through that with me, people who helped me get through it. So you all know who you are, and I'm grateful to all of those folks who were part of that journey. So Trinity will always be a special place for me. We adopted Cameron when I was on the staff here at Trinity. Some of you may remember that, a long time ago, almost 33 years ago now. Cameron was baptized in this church over at the 8th Avenue campus. And Cameron went to Stepping Stones at preschool as a little guy. And that was a most wonderful, nurturing program. So I'm grateful for that, too. So I want to start out and tell you a little bit about the worst day of my life. August 9th, 2013, I received a phone call that somehow I dreaded would come. It was a phone call that I knew would come. And it was the phone call that no parent ever wants to receive. On the other end of the line was my son's dad, choking back tears, telling me that our son Cameron was in the ICU in Colorado as a result of a heroin overdose. When I finally realized that I was being asked whether or not I would agree to take him off the life support, I said, well, I guess we will have to let him go. And so I have spent the last 5 years of my life on a journey of letting him go. There's so much I could share with you tonight about the roller coaster ride of Cameron's addiction. Much of it is in the book, but I focus tonight on the unique aspects of losing a child to a heroin overdose. And I share with you tonight how I have been navigating it. One of the things that is so striking to me, and I'm sure to you, as the newspaper headlines have been covering the opioid epidemic for the last several years, the statistics are staggering. In 2017, over 70,000 people in the US died of a drug overdose. I live in Palm Beach County. Down there, 600 people died in 1 year from an opioid overdose. That's more young people than died in the Vietnam War. That's more young people than died from HIV/AIDS. In 2017, 37,000 people died in car accidents. That means that nearly twice the number died from a drug overdose as died in a car accident. When I think about these numbers, I realize that these data mean that in just that year, over 140,000 parents lost children to this disease. And then you think about all the family members, the siblings, the friends that have lost someone to an opioid overdose. I'm just wondering, show of hands if you feel comfortable doing so. How many people know someone or knows of someone who's lost a person to a drug or alcohol overdose? Look around, folks. That's almost everyone. Thank you. That's almost everyone in the room has some connection to some person or some family that has experienced this loss. So it's pretty significant. It is an epidemic, and it's creating so much trauma in individuals and families across our country, and especially in our state. So one of the conclusions is that it's really hard to think about my son as a statistic. Really hard to think about him as one of 70,000 people that was lost to this. And when I started thinking about drug addicts, when I learned that Cameron had this disease and this problem, I flashed back to a book I read when I was in the 7th grade in a Bible study in my community. It was a book called The Cross and the Switchblade. I don't know if anybody read this back in the 60s. I have to tell you, it scared me to death. And it also created an image for me about who drug addicts are. And my vision was people that are unsavory, lurking in the shadows of New York City, people who are gang members, juvenile delinquents. When all of this started for Cameron, I had no idea that so many white, middle to upper middle class, young suburban folks were addicted to opioids. I simply had no idea. So to give you a little background, some of you know this, some of you were there. We adopted Cameron, as I said, in 1986. He was born and lived in our family and lived what I think, looking back, was a very privileged life. He had parents who adored him. He had educational opportunities. He had lots of travel domestically and internationally. He went to summer camp. He had lots of friends. And he was in church every Sunday for 18 years. Not always willingly, but he was there until he turned 18. So all of this went on. His father and I knew and practiced appropriate parenting. In fact, some of you know that I even taught parenting classes at the mental health center here in Gainesville for several years. We were on top of that. We knew what the literature said about good parenting. And so as this situation began to unfold and as Cameron's life began to unravel, I kept telling myself that as a mental health professional with a Ph.D. in counseling, and as a clergy person with many, many years of experience by then, that I should have been able to do something to prevent his tragic death. After all, I had tremendous knowledge, training, experience, and faith. We did everything we could. We sent him to counseling. We went with him to counseling. He went to more than one rehab program, and none of it was enough to turn the tide of his heroin addiction. So that's kind of the horrible, tragic story. And so I felt led to write this book as a means of kind of paying it forward in terms of the fact that when I began to reflect on this, about all the resources I had to manage a tragedy, I thought that it was incumbent on me to use those to try to help others who weren't as fortunate as I am to have been as prepared as I was and how overwhelmed I was despite everything that was in my toolkit. So let me share with you a few of the unique aspects of losing a child to an opioid death. First of all, losing a child to anything is simply horrific. Doesn't matter the cause. Losing a child is really, really difficult. And the reason is because it's off time, as psychologists say. It's out of sync with how we think the world is supposed to be. We do not expect to outlive our children. So that's one thing that this kind of a death has in common with the loss of any child. But there are some unique differences. And I would say the first one is the reality of stigma. This is a really, really tough thing. And it comes out of a history of people thinking about addictions of any kind, but especially drugs, and then especially heroin. People thinking about addiction as a character flaw, thinking about it as a moral failure or a lack of willpower. Some of it dates back to Prohibition, and there was all kinds of clouds of ideas about how morally wrong drinking was at that time. Another part of the stigma can be traced back to the days when drug use became a crime. And so now we think about drug users as criminals. So that creates stigma. And then there's the prevalence of relapse. It almost always happens. No matter what kind of addiction, it almost always happens. And you know what happens when a person relapses when they're a drug or alcohol addicted person? What happens is that we judge them differently than we judge people with other illnesses. For example, I think about the average heart patient who has a heart attack. That person comes back from the hospital and is told to eat a healthy diet, to have good nutrition, but we don't really judge them when they have burger and fries. You know, we don't really put a lot of negative thoughts on them when we see them out in a restaurant having a milkshake. But we do that to folks who have a relapse when they're a drug or alcohol user. There are also cultural views that are part of the stigma, and that has to do with the fact that we make really big assumptions about the demographics of drug users. We think that it has to do with race or gender or social class. And I have to tell you, this problem cuts across all of those things, all of those things. So besides the stigma, which is huge, there are other things that are unique about this kind of a loss. One of them is feeling guilty for not doing enough to prevent the death versus enabling the addiction. So those of us who know something about an addiction, we know that there are behaviors like giving the person more money to buy more drugs as an enabling behavior. But then when we don't do it and our child dies from an overdose, we think, oh, well, you know, I should have done more. So there's that kind of a trap. The other thing is that we who lose our children to an overdose spend a long time grieving someone who is alive. What we see die is the person that we knew before the illness took over. So we're already in a long grief process before we're ever faced with the death. One of the folks whose work I've read, Sandy Swinson, said in her website, she said, to love an addict is to run out of tears. Love an addict is to run out of tears. So we feel guilty for not doing enough. And then when our loved one dies, we feel relieved in some ways because of the ride that we've been on. And then we feel guilty for feeling relieved. It's a pretty heavy kind of a loss. The other thing that happens, and I think this happens more frequently than we're aware of, as parents, we feel blamed for the addiction. Stay with me for a minute. In this culture, and those of us who have mental health training, we know that historically, many mental health problems were considered early on to be the problem of bad parenting. Refrigerator parents, parents in conflict. There are all these theories about why mental health issues were the result of bad parenting. And so we tend to believe that children who abuse drugs do so because they have poor parenting. That's a pretty heavy thing to carry. Carrying all these other things, now we got to be blamed for our children's addiction. If there's someone to blame, then we tell ourselves that this horrible life of addiction and overdose could not possibly happen to us. If we blame someone, then we're able to believe that we're somehow insulated from this happening to us. And that's why I think that we get blamed, because other people don't want to have to go through what we've been through, so they just blame us. That there must have been something that you didn't do right that caused your child to become an addict. But I've learned in this long journey that there is really no insulation. No one is immune. I've got a really good friend who has this great maxim. She says, it's really important to know whether a problem can be solved with money. And she says, you don't really have to have the money. You just need to know whether it's a problem that can be solved with money. So your roof leaks, well, you may not have the money, but that could be solved with money. If your child has an addiction, it cannot be solved with money. And that is really, really hard to take. Even if your child has all of the long list of positive assets, and years ago, I guess maybe it's still going on now, there's a long list of things that if your child had these assets, then they were going to have protective factors that kept them from being so vulnerable to these kinds of problems. And I can tell you, Cameron had almost every one on that list, but it wasn't enough to protect him. So we who experience this buy into that blame. We take that on, and we begin to tell ourselves that we have failed as parents and that we have raised bad kids. That's a pretty hard place to be when you've spent so much time, energy, money, love, trying to raise a responsible adult, and then you begin to feel like you're a failure and that you have bad kids. Again, I read this small quote that I've had to write down and put in front of me so much. And it says, I am an imperfect mom. Imperfect parenting does not cause addiction. If that were so, every child would grow up to be an addict. So that's been pretty comforting to me. So all of these factors that I've just discussed make this kind of grief much more complicated than it already is. And what happens as a result of these things is that there is a failure on our part to get support because we're too ashamed to talk about it, and we feel too awkward, and therefore all of that leads us to a terrible kind of isolation. I think about if Cameron had died from cancer or a car accident, there would have been a flood of sympathy. But there wasn't as much as there might have been, probably because people thought that it was contagious. So the question is, well, how have I coped with this? I've been in my 6th year now, and one thing that I've learned, even though I knew this, and here's where the rub is, there's a huge difference between knowing something and experiencing it. So I knew all of the grief theories, of course I did. Many of you familiar with Kubler-Ross's stages? We learn this in the social sciences almost anywhere. That denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance kind of linear model. It is not like that. Anybody who's lost anybody, it is not like that. So what contemporary researchers have discovered and what I experienced is, oh no, it's more like a cyclone. It goes around and around and around. It goes back and forth, up and down, all over the place, not predictable. And because that's borne out by very good research, I know that my experience was not crazy, it was reality. So that was one thing. The other thing that I learned by getting better at my research on grief and loss was that there is kind of a loss orientation and a restoration orientation. And that means that to get through this kind of a loss, you have to focus on the loss at some time, and you cry and wail and, gnash your teeth, everything. And then you get up and balance your checkbook, and you go to work. And that's the reorientation orientation. And so this whole thing of loss and restoration, we go back and forth, and that's the way we live ourselves through this kind of a challenge. So I've changed my mind about what grief really is like. And I've had to practice more self-care, had to take care of myself emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually, had to think about getting exercise, monitoring my sleep, eating well, spending time in meditation and mindfulness. All of these things have really been so helpful to my personal survival. I've had to be more empathic for myself, to give myself a little bit more grace, the kind of grace I extend to other people. I've had to extend to myself. I've had to develop compassion for others. I love that quote that says, "Be kind. Everyone is carrying a burden you know nothing about." So developing that kind of compassion. Cultivating resilience, being very intentional about figuring out what can I do to survive this, to live through this. One is to build on my existing strengths, and I think that's really why I wrote the book, was I had some really good strengths and resources, so I've tried to put them to use. Identifying a sense of purpose. The sense of purpose is I don't want my son's life and death to be in vain. I want it to be a message to help someone who needs it. Another thing I've done about resilience is to try to reframe my thinking. And I would say it's probably the third day after Cameron's death, I saw a poster that said, "If only and I should have will eat your brain." You might want to write that down because it's good for lots of things. If only and I should have will eat your brain. The other thing that I've been able to do is to be aware of when I was going down a rabbit hole of thoughts and blame and a sense of failure. I reminded myself that I taught counseling theories 42 times. And in there is a guy named Adler who had this thing about the push button technique. And that is that when you have thoughts that are not helping you, you push a button in your mind and stop them so that they don't eat your brain. So that's been really helpful. I never knew why all of that over and over and over again, counseling theories would really become real. But that one piece really works. The other thing is I've had to accept change. I've had to learn to live into the new normal, to realize that life will never be like it was before. Of course it's not fair, and of course it's tragic, but acceptance is the only path. It's really the only path. Many of you know about Robert Niemeyer. He's a grief expert. He's written volumes about grief and loss. He says that there are two things that have to happen to navigate your way through a grief experience, and one of them is making sense of the loss. And there are lots of ways to do that, but it's essentially asking yourself, why did this happen? And then developing a narrative that tells a story that helps you make sense of the answers to that question. So for me, I say a lot more about this in the book, but for me, it was kind of a confluence of biology, what happens in the body when one takes a drug? Genetics. We learned that Cameron's birth parent had an addiction. Some genetics there. Chemistry. Drugs are chemicals, and they interact with the chemicals in the brain, and they take over the pleasure pathways so that nothing is as pleasurable as the drug. There were peers. Who would have thought that living in an upper middle class neighborhood, every kid on the cul-de-sac would have a drug problem? What's the likelihood of that? But the peers were there. He made choices. And then as you learn more about the drug dealing industry, there are some people who made it very easy for kids with resources to buy drugs. All you need is a cell phone and $5, and you're there. So it wasn't just individual things, it was also a systemic project of folks selling drugs to kids. So I've learned to build a narrative about what happened to Cameron. Yes, he had vulnerabilities, and unfortunately, when that drug gets in your system and your brain is not developed, what does it do? It attacks the decision-making part of your brain. So he was really vulnerable to continuing to make bad decisions. One of the other things that I've had to do is to say, well, now that this has happened, how am I going to respond to it? And then again, an existentialist, Viktor Frankl, Holocaust survivor, he said, everything can be taken from us but one thing, the last of human freedoms, the ability to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances. So choosing an attitude to live into this new normal is what I've had to do. The other part that Niemeyer talks about is benefit finding, and it seems a little bit ridiculous to find benefit in something so tragic. It's really hard to imagine, but the researchers have really shown this to be true. So I've had to think about, well, has any good come out of this? And I have to say, well, I've discovered I'm stronger and more courageous than I ever dared to dream. I have learned who can tolerate my pain and who cannot. I have had to shift my priorities, knowing that we are all given one day at a time. And I have really learned what it means to say that no love is ever lost or wasted. So those are the kind of things I've had to do. I did some other really specific things, and one was make a memory book of pictures of Cameron's life, and that's been wonderful. It sits on the coffee table so I can take a look. And that process reminded me that Cameron isn't defined by his addiction. He had a whole life, a whole wonderful life aside from that. And so I don't want to remember him by his addiction. It was a part of him, but it was not all of him. So I've been moving forward. Writing the book was also something to do that, in retrospect, has been a huge part of my healing process. And so I just wanted to close my comments here and share with you a piece of what I wrote at the very end of this book. And it's about this Japanese art form. Many of you have heard of it, kintsugi. It's a process where Japanese bowls are repaired. Most people would like to have such damages hidden so that when they're repaired, they look like new. But this art form follows a different philosophy. Rather than concealing the breakage, it restores the broken item by incorporating the damage into the aesthetic. It makes that broken part of the object's history. Kintsugi uses lacquer resin mixed with powdered gold, silver, platinum, copper, or bronze, resulting in something more beautiful than the original. And so I say here, kind of in closing, all of us who've experienced the death of a child are like the Japanese bowls. There are cracks and scars in our lives that we have no need to hide. Through our grief journeys, those fractures have been filled with the gold of resilience, the gold of support and love, the gold of spirituality, the gold of making meaning of loss, the gold of gratitude, the gold of remembrance. During the difficult days when we are aware of the brokenness and the grief, may we, the ones left behind, always remember the gold that fills our emptiness and makes us shine. Thank you.
So I just want to share with you a little bit about where we're going to go from here. I really appreciate Marsha sharing with all of us about what it feels like and looks like to be, to wear the label of a parent of a child who has died of addiction, a parent of a child who has an addiction, your experience of learning how to cope and what works for you, your experience of how to wring some good out of it somehow. And now what we want to do is open it up to questions for you all. You may have some more questions about any of those things. You might have some questions about Marsha's journey of walking with Cameron through this, and she just wants to be able to share with you authentically. So we'll have some Q&A. Roger will pass the mic around, or take the mic around to anybody who has a question. And then after that, I'm going to close us with prayer and invite anybody who would like to move to tables at the back where there are some questions and someone who'll be facilitating just some more personal conversation, if that would be helpful to you, if that would be meaningful to you. So we'll have open Q&A first, and then we'll move back to the tables after prayer. And as we do that, then Marsha is going to go out in the back, and she will have these books for sale for anybody who's leaving or for those who leave later and is willing to sign those. And again, this is her way of helping to make a difference and share what she's learned through her writing. So I'll open it up to questions from you, and Roger will take the mic around, and Marsha.
Raise your hand and we'll get the mic to you.
Welcome home. It's good to have you back.
Thank you.
I'm a retired elementary teacher, and as soon as you said that Cameron was adopted and his birth mother had addiction problems, that just rings a bell. Because I know from firsthand experience, heredity and environment is what shapes a child. And I've known several situations where blessed children have been adopted in the best family in the entire world, and just like you did everything right, you did nothing wrong, but what they were born with was so overpowering. I have a neighbor right now that's lost a grandson to drugs. The son is on his last leg. We're going to read about him in the paper before too many years. The aunt and uncle are just falling down drunks. It's pitiful. It is a disease of addiction that there's nothing you could have done. It just is like they came that way. And you work with what you've got, and you love what you have. And if it comes to the point to where you lose them like this, the good Lord's got them. And you did all you could do. There's nothing that coulda, shoulda, woulda, had. And we learned years ago from Dan Johnson, it can be well with my soul, even though it's not well with my circumstances. Now, I'm not talking about the song.
Oh,
so you did the best you could with what you had to work with, and the Lord's going to bless you and bless him. But as soon as you said his birth mother struggled with it, it is a disease. It's like the BRCA gene, or whatever you call it, that women are predestined to have breast cancer, aunts and grandmothers and all that. It's just there. So thank you for being an adopted mother and doing the best you could.
Thank you.
Hi, Marsha. It's Barbara Brown. I just wondered how many years or how long did Cameron deal with the addiction, and what age was he when he passed away?
Okay, thank you. Cameron started smoking cigarettes at 14, and it progressed from there to marijuana. And I'm not sure I know all the story, although since I've written this book, some of his friends have contacted me and said, we're willing to tell you everything you want to know. So hopefully my trip to Colorado will provide more information about the progression, but I know that he got into marijuana. I know that he was working in retail and doing a lot of lifting. He got into prescription painkillers. Those prescriptions ran out. He shifted over to heroin. So he was 26 when he died of the overdose. And so part of it, everybody's story is different, but he got involved in the worst part of it after he was an adult. So he wasn't living with us, he was out on his own, and then at the end, I was retired from the university and back in Florida when he died, so I wasn't there for the last horrific days and years of it.
Someone else?
Jean.
May I tell a happy story?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you know, I'm so proud of you, Marsha. We're all so proud of you. Thank you for doing this for us. But I can't think of him in any other way than the joy we had and how excited we were that he was coming to us. And we felt like it was to all of us. Baby showers and all kinds of fun events. And when that baby arrived, you know, and you let us know, David Dodge got the bus out, and we took the kids from Cheers, and we made up some sort of a field trip, but we really came to your house so that we could greet this precious baby. I can't think of him any other way than that. And the wonderful family he came to, but also to the church family. So you really gave us a wonderful gift.
Thank you.
We've had some friends that lost a son about Cameron's age in a drug deal, and we were talking afterwards, and their comment to us was, you know, when you lose your parents, you lose your past. And when you lose your child, you lose your future. What do you say to people like that? I mean, how do you say that's not true? Or
well, you know, when I think about that, I think, yes, there's so much that will never happen. You know, Cameron was our only child. So people in my peer group are having grandchildren now, which is a future that I won't have. Fortunately, there's lots of children around that need lots of love, so they seem to be willing to take that attention. But it's a personal experience that is something I'm not going to ever have. There's obviously weddings that people dream about. There's careers, there's college, there's careers, there's experiences that are never going to happen. And that's part of the real tragedy of it. And then I think, you know, none of us knows what our future is. We only have today, so maybe there's some fantastic future out there that I could never have or experience without having this particular loss. So I'm trying to be open to what comes and to be present enough to recognize it and to grab hold of it when it's there.
Someone else?
Even though Cameron was an adult when you lost him,
yes,
was there ever a time that the two of you were able to talk about this, about drugs he was taking or how he was feeling, or was he ever able to share anything with you?
Well, he didn't deny it. Let's put it that way. We had conversations about it, but it was, in the early days, it was mostly me trying to nag him about quitting. And then sometimes nag, sometimes drag him to some form of therapy. But I have to confess that even after 2 or 3 rehabs, there wasn't any change. One time I flew all the way from Florida to Colorado, got a car, raced to a rehab center family meeting, and he lasted 2 minutes and walked out, and was then put on the street because insurance wasn't going to pay for a person who was not compliant. So yes, we had lots and lots of conversations about it, but I have to say that even after inpatient rehab, all kinds of programs, and you know, I had to really swallow my pride and call my former students at rehab centers and ask them to take him. And he walked out of one of those because he said, well, you know, all of these people know you, so I'm not staying here. So really, when he died, he wasn't interested in getting clean because he was still under the power of that force.
We all know that there's a genetic problem, and that certainly is a factor, a big factor. However, the silliest thing we can ever say is, oh, this can never happen to me. Every one of us can become addicted under circumstances that we cannot even imagine. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming. How did you deal with the isolation you felt as a parent having a child who was addicted to drugs? I know as a mental health professional you knew not to isolate, but I'm sure as a parent you did isolate.
Well, fortunately, I had a lot of good friends that I could rely on that I believed accepted me unconditionally. And one of the real gifts on this side of the loss has been talking to some of those people who said, we were in your home. We watched you parent this child. We heard the stories about how much time, energy, and money you spent to try to help him into recovery. So that witness of people who walked that journey with us has been the most powerful gift. And what I have to say now, and that's part of why I'm willing to do these talks, is that we have to speak out about addiction and about the shame and the blame. And if we don't do it, it's going to continue. And so I think speaking about it helps break the isolation.
Hey, I'm Sabrina. I don't know that I have a question, but I do want to say that in April, I'll celebrate 7 years of sobriety. But in order to get there, I had to want to do it for me, you know. And my older children's, their dad, he committed suicide because he couldn't get it, you know. And it's hard, and it scares me to death because all three of my kids, both of their parents, you know, because of course I fall in love with alcoholics and addicts. Luckily, this one's in sobriety. But I just wanted to say thank you.
Anybody have a burning question? We're running out of time. Does anyone have something they just need to ask? You're welcome to. I'm not trying to shut it down by any means, if you have. All right, if not, we'll give it to Pastor Catherine and let her lead us in prayer.
So yeah, let's pray together. And then again, after we pray, it's not the end. You're welcome to stay. We would invite you to stay. And we've got some tables set up at the back. If we have more people than we have space for at tables, we'll just form some circles with chairs. But time for you all to have some conversation, for us to have conversation among ourselves. And there's some questions and facilitators for those table groups. Want to say anything else?
Thank you for being here. It feels wonderful to be back at Trinity. I love that, so thank you.
Let's pray. Oh God, we give you thanks for this day. We give you thanks for earth and heaven, for sea and sky. We give you thanks for your Spirit, which moves in and among all of creation and each of us. Tonight we give thanks for Marsha and for her vulnerability, for her authenticity, for her honesty in sharing her story, in hopes that her story will have an impact on others. I give you thanks for each person here and for their willingness to be here, because they want to learn, because they want to grow, because they struggle with addiction, because they are in recovery from addiction, because they have lost a child, because they have experienced loss. I thank you for their presence here. And oh God, we pray that as we put our trust in you, you will guide us each and every day, that you will undergird us, that you will hover over us, that you will be a shield ahead of us, and that you will urge us on from behind, so that we might live fully into who you have created us to be, and be bearers of your light and your love and your grace in the world. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.